Okay, well, we're progressing through Job. We're getting into some of the heavy bits. And we see in today's reading that our ability to cope with sufferings depends on our expectations. And that's true for those of us with faith as well. When we're suffering, how do we expect our faith to help us? What difference do we expect it to make? How should we expect it to help us? And what if it doesn't do what we think it will? What if it doesn't live up to our expectations? How will we respond? Will our faith stand up to that? In recent years, philosophers and cultural analysts have spoken of the time we live in as the therapeutic age, in which we're supremely concerned with how we feel and the inner sense of self. Here's a paragraph from the online Christian journal Mere Orthodoxy, published late last year. The therapeutic world tells us a story for us to live in. It tells us that the goal of life is to find peace, that the problem of the world is whatever causes us pain or discomfort, that the world is a dangerous place full of exploitation and trauma, that the way to find peace from those things is purely utilitarian. Whatever works for you is fine, and that the best thing we can do is to minimise as much discomfort as possible. The path to the good life is through doing the work. And if you do all the things you're supposed to do and don't find peace, then it's simply because you didn't master the right technique, and you should try something else. The best thing we can do is to minimise as much discomfort as possible. That's the life purpose of the therapeutic age. And certainly, pain, discomfort and trauma are real, and they're not good. They're not as the world should be. The Bible agrees that they are intruders, part of a fallen world. But the Bible offers a very different solution. The therapeutic world expects them to be avoided, fixed at all costs, in whatever way works for us. It sees Christianity as, at best, just a technique to try. And if it's tried and found wanting, then move on and try something else. But what if that search is futile? What if it's offering a false hope, a never-ending search for solutions that don't satisfy because suffering can't be eliminated? What if the question isn't how to get rid of suffering, but how to live with it? Last week, Daniel Lowe got us started in the prologue, where we saw that Job has lost everything and he's sat in mourning for a week and his friends have sat with him in silence. Today, we get into the dialogue. The bulk of Job is a series of conversations. Most of these are between Job and three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar, trying to make sense of what's happened to Job. Of course, we can't cover the whole book, so we're going to look each week at a representative section, and today's is chapter 10, which touches on a number of things Job says through the book. And we're going to look at four things that we see him say in this chapter. First, innocence doesn't get us out of suffering. One of the most well-known features of Job is that he maintains his innocence all the way through. He says to God in verses 5 to 7, "Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a strong man, that you must search out my faults and probe after my sin, though you know that I am not guilty, and that no one can rescue me from your hand?" And he says to his friends in places like chapter 6, "Teach me and I'll be quiet. Show me where I have been wrong." And as readers, we know he's right. The very first verse of the book says Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. But Job doesn't get the benefit of that insight. For Job and his friends, this is a live question. So Job has to keep defending himself again and again. Now, this doesn't mean that Job was a perfect human without sin. Part of being blameless and upright, as we saw in chapter 1, was that he would make sacrifices for his family and presumably for himself as well. Sacrifices to atone for sin. At other times in the book, he refers to minor sins. For example, chapter 7, he says, "Why do you not pardon my offences and forgive my sins?" Job is presented to us as an ordinary human, but one with integrity, blameless and upright, like other characters in the Bible like Noah, Abraham, Daniel. The point is that this suffering has come on even the best of people. It was not deserved. That's consistent with how Job defends himself. He denies that he has some great hidden sin that would explain this suffering. But while he defends himself, he also says, what does it matter? It makes no difference. I'm still in no position to argue with God. Verse 15, if I am guilty, woe to me. But even if I am innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my affliction. If we think faith is making a bargain with God, that if we do the right thing, then he'll reward us in return, that we'll be free from suffering, then we'll be disappointed. Job did that. And we see that even the best people suffer with no explanation. That's something that we have to come to terms with in life. In the face of that, another response we can have is to suppress how we feel about our suffering, not talk about it to others, not even admit it to ourselves. But the second thing we see in this chapter is that we can be honest with God about how we feel. Verse 18. Why did you bring me out of the womb? I wish I had died before any eye saw me. Are not my few days almost over? Turn away from me so I can have a moment's joy before I go to the place of no return. Job lets it all out. He curses the day he was born. He goes into detail about how his groans pour out like water, how his days fly away without a glimpse of joy. He calls on God in chapter 6 saying, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life." Job may have started as an extraordinary example of piety and kind of stoicism and righteousness, saying that, what was it that he said? Anyway, from earlier in the book, from chapter 2. We'll talk about that in future weeks. But as it goes on and he goes into despair, he becomes less composed and dignified. He's no superhuman untouched by grief. He's one of us. One commentator tells the story of a woman who suffered severe nerve pain after a car accident and a nerve transplant. And speaking of her own despair and experiences and trying to help other people, what she thought from her experience would be helpful for them, she said, "I would first and foremost listen. I would intentionally listen to hope that I understood what they were trying to communicate before offering my opinion. Then I would greatly encourage them to take it day by day. And when we are called to be in his presence, it will be the right time. But until then, we're to seek him and offer our sufferings and our desire for death to him. For when do the stars shine the brightest? When the sky is the darkest and there's no other light in sight. When we're in dark times and can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, those are the times we seek Christ and experience him in a real way. Heaven will come in its time, but for now we are to take it one day at a time." There are things we might think or feel towards God that we think are wrong. We're worried that we shouldn't be thinking this way. But even if that's true, God can cope with it. It's better to be turning to God and telling him how we really feel than letting suffering turn us away from God. What faith looks like in that despair is to know that our life is in God's hands for good or ill. The third thing we see in this passage, God, equally confronting, God is ultimately the one behind this suffering. Verse 8, "Your hands shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you moulded me like clay. Will you turn me to dust again?" Now, as readers, we are privy to the heavenly court where the Satan, the accuser, put God to the test about whether Job would fear God even if he lost all the good things that God had given him. So there's a story there. We know that there's some complexity to the origin of suffering. But even as we read what happened and Satan coming and challenging God, we can scratch our heads at this. Why would God allow such a thing to happen? Really, we don't know much more than Job. Why God would allow this suffering is still a mystery. Job knows that while the reason for suffering is elusive, ultimately God is behind it. At the very least, God has allowed a world to exist in which there is much suffering. For some people, that's a reason not to believe in God. Why would God do this? While we can't address that in depth today, here are some thoughts. One of the main reasons I believe in Christianity is that it does the best job of explaining the world as it is. And this includes suffering. While we don't always know why particular suffering happens to particular people, Christianity does have an explanation for general suffering, why there is suffering at all. It says there's a spiritual reason, for we are spiritual creatures made in God's image. And when humanity decided collectively to turn away from God, the consequence of that was judgment, including the entry of suffering and death into the world. While this isn't popular, if we look at how atrociously humans behave in the world, it's actually realistic. Christianity both says that suffering is not meaningless, and Christianity provides a way out of humanity's sorry state. I think denying God makes less sense of suffering, because it means the world is an accident with no purpose and that suffering is a random feature with no meaning. While it's confronting to say God is ultimately behind suffering, it's also a position from which we can see a glimmer of hope. And we see that hope in action in the final point. Number 4, God is the one we must bring our complaints to. Because God is ultimately behind suffering, Job has someone to complain to. He's not just shouting into the wind. And he takes up that opportunity enthusiastically. Verse 2, "I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked?" Elsewhere he says, God ignores Job's requests. This is from chapter 30. "I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me." The commentator, Old Testament commentator David Kleins, says there are 3 questions the book of Job raises about suffering. There are many questions and things that it talks about, but these 3 are particularly prominent. First, why am I suffering? This question is not answered. Job never finds out why his suffering has happened. The book doesn't answer it for us. Second, is suffering always deserved? Well, this question is answered, and the answer is simple. No. Innocent people suffer, like Job. But it's the third question the book is really interested in, and this question is, how should I suffer? When I'm suffering, what attitude should I take? And this question takes 40 chapters to answer. Here's how David Kleins summarizes the answer for us. If you're suffering and you don't know why, here is what the book of Job recommends. If possible, suffer like the patient Job from chapter 2. This is an ideal, but very hard. If you can't be patient any longer, you need to let it out, then what? Let your grief and anger and distress direct you towards God. Acknowledge God as the ultimate source of suffering, because only through encounter with God can the anguish be released. This is what Job does. He doesn't hide his suffering or suppress it or deny it, nor does he descend into uncontrolled anger, shouting into the wind in desperation. He lets his grief and anger and distress direct him towards God. When he cries out, why? It's to God that he cries. When he's angry about his suffering, he's angry at God. When he's desperate for release from his anguish, he turns to God as the only one who can give it to him. As Christians, we have all the more reason to be confident about doing this. Back in just the previous chapter, chapter 9, verse 33 and 34 say this. This is Job speaking. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Well, Job's wish would be answered in a greater way than he could have imagined. We do have a mediator, not only one who is in a position who can appeal to God for us, but also who was truly innocent, more undeserving of suffering than Job, and yet who suffered willingly for us, and so who can walk with us in all our suffering. We know that our complaints don't fall on deaf ears, but they fall on one who knows suffering as much and more than we do. We will all suffer. It can't be avoided. And some of us will suffer significantly. But what the therapeutic age offers is a lie. No technique will make it go away. In fact, the point of the article I quoted at the start was that many techniques we try, especially finding a community on social media who might be suffering like we are, or online self-diagnosis, they only make it worse. Christianity is realistic and it refuses to offer quick fixes. What it does offer is a God who will stand by you no matter what you throw at him. Let me finish with a conclusion from that article from Mere Orthodoxy. When we view ourselves as a creature who is in creation and under the Creator God, we're relieved from the pressure to embody God's divine attributes. We are able to embrace our natural limits and not feel the need to consolidate all power, knowledge, and presence in our small human frame. We can rest in the God who is over all things, sustains all things, and cares for all things. When life spins out of control, we have a God who we can trust, who isn't scared of the things that scare us, and who cares for us enough to carry us through all of our struggles and suffering. Let's pray. Sovereign Lord, you know all our sufferings more than we can imagine. Thank you that our cries to you do not fall on deaf ears. Help us to turn to you with our suffering, with all our despair, anger, feelings of unfairness, frustration, knowing that you can cope, that we are yours, and that you have gone before us. Amen.